All right, so let's start by looking at some of the functions of the kidneys. Now, the kidneys, if you look at them grossly, which we did this morning, they don't look very fancy, right? They look pretty simple, but the kidneys perform a very complex set of physiology. They're responsible for balancing water in our body, which means balancing our blood volume, which essentially is blood pressure, right? They're also important in balancing our blood pH, how much acid versus how much alkaline is in the blood. They're important in regulating plasma ion concentrations, such as sodium, chloride, potassium. A lot of this happens by the fine-tuned regulation that happens in the kidneys, right? Eliminating organic matter, such as nitrogen and ammonia, things that are byproducts from metabolic processes that have to be rid from the body, happens via the kidneys as well. And then some of the other functions here prevent dehydration. Again, if you're in a dehydrated state, the kidneys chip in to help conserve some of that water. So they prevent mass or extreme dehydration in that way. And then they help the liver with some of their functions, such as gluconeogenesis, which is the production of glucogen. Alrighty. Moving on to the structure of the kidneys. First of all, we have two kidneys. If that isn't apparent up to this point, and maybe you missed the lab, but we have two kidneys, so they're paired. They're associated with the adrenal glands, which sit on top of them. Each kidney is associated with the ureter. A ureter is basically the tube or the duct that transports urine made from those kidneys down to the bladder, right? Now, the bladder is basically a storage organ, similar to the gallbladder. Its job is basically to store the productions of another organ. So very similarly here, urine just sits in the bladder until it's time to be voided, right? And finally, the urethra is that final structure that leads to the external surface of the body. So the urethra is going to be shorter in females. We'll talk about why, and it's going to be longer in males. We'll look at that later. Getting into some of the details here, the right kidney is covered by the liver, right? It's also lower because of the liver. It comes in contact with the hepatic flexure or the right colic flexure, which we talked about last week. It also comes in contact with the duodenum on the right. The left kidney, however, comes in contact with the spleen, very close contact with the spleen, the pancreas, as well as the splenic flexure or the left colic flexure, and then the jejunum as opposed to the duodenum. Now, the left kidney, again, as we mentioned in the lab this morning, is a little bit higher than the right, and that's because of the right side being so dominant with the liver. Right? Both glands come in contact with the adrenal. Let's talk about the layers of the kidney. We have three layers: the fibrous capsule, which is the outer protective layer of the kidneys. This is an important layer when we have any trauma in the abdomen. If there's bleeding in the kidneys, it's usually pretty well contained within the kidneys. And so that actually acts as a way to stop some of that bleeding. The pressure that's put as blood builds up within that fibrous capsule and is not allowed to escape. We'll talk about the perinephric fat, which is a fat around the kidneys, which is the second protective layer. And then finally, the renal fascia, which is the third protective layer of the kidneys. We talked about the hilum this morning. Can anyone remind us what the hilum is? Should be a review.
It's like the area where all the vessels go in and out of the kidneys.
Right, correct. So the area, that indentation of the medial border of the kidney, where vessels as well as the ureters and nerves are entering and leaving the kidney. That's the hilum. So we have entering and leaving here the paired renal veins and the paired renal arteries. Again, looking closer into the kidney, right, taking a frontal or coronal plane right down the middle of the kidney, we can identify some of the internal structures. This should be a review for us at this point. We know the cortex, which is the outer pale region, is different from the medulla, which is that inner, more pink appearing region. The medulla is distinguished by the renal pyramids, which are the pyramidal structures in the center. I'll point some of these out. Right, so we got the renal pyramids here, these pyramidal structures. These are separating the renal columns. So these spaces in between the pyramids are the renal columns. We have the renal papilla, or the plural papillae, which are the projections or the tips of the renal pyramids. And then we have the calyces, so the minor calyces and the major calyces, and then the renal pelvis. Right. Let's look more microscopically. Let's look at the histological components of the kidney. Now we know the structural and functional unit of the kidney is called the nephron. And a little later, we're going to draw out the actual parts of the nephron. But for right now, we're just looking at the big picture of the kidney's function, the kidney structure. The nephron basically has two parts. It has the glomerular capsule, which has the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule. And then it has the tubular structure. So it continues on the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henry, also called the nephron loop, and the distal convoluted tubule. The main function of the nephron is to filter blood from the systemic circulation. So blood that is moving throughout your body goes to your kidneys. It's going to be filtered, some of it, we'll talk about how much of it. It's going to be filtered through the glomerulus, and we're going to basically work on fine-tuning that filtrate through a series of steps, series of processes until we get urine. So the big picture here is that the nephron basically takes blood, filters it, squeezes most of everything out, and then the kidney goes through a series of processes of fine-tuning that filtrate, and then what's left is basically waste. That's what the body does not want, and that's what we call urine. That is expelled through the ureters. So that's the process we're interested in as we look at the kidneys. What is the kidneys doing to this blood that it filters to make urine? How does it fine-tune that fluid? How does it fine-tune that filtrate? Okay. So let's draw out the parts of the nephron. And of course, I'm going to grab my markers. I'll be back in a minute.
All of those 25 minutes. Yep. I tried to just bend all the people who worked at Jimmy John's. They were not. I was going to give them like 12 hours. But they would have made it though. Okay. Thank you.
There are places that accept.
No, I was just trying to, I don't know what the word for it.
Oh, and we would even
For like $8 extra. Yeah, yeah. That's what I'm saying.
Like, it's
Yeah.
all good, yeah, for sure.
One of the workers was like, shit, I would do it, but I don't do them. But then the other two were just like, nah. I don't do that.
So we're going to look at the parts of the nephron. And we'll talk a little bit later on. There are two different types of nephrons that are shaped a little bit differently, and they have different purposes, and we'll talk more about that. But just for general purposes, we had our two layers. So the cortex, which is going to be this outer pale region, and then we have the inner medulla. Now the renal corpuscle is actually in the cortex. So it's going to be in the outer pale region of the kidney. And the cortex is basically where we have the renal corpuscle. All right, so we have a glomerulus. Now the glomerulus is nothing but a ball of capillaries. That's the way I want you to think about it. A ball of capillaries that are going to be bunched up and stuffed into this capsule. So this is your glomerulus. Now it's going to be stuffed into this double-walled capsule that's called the Bowman's capsule. Right? And it's very intimately connected here with the glomerulus. Okay. So this is the Bowman's capsule, sometimes called the glomerular capsule. Those are interchangeable. And then this is going to continue on throughout the kidneys. So this is the renal corpuscle, and the remainder of the structure are the tubular structures that are differently named according to different parts. So the first part is going to be the proximal convoluted tubule. Convoluted just means that it's doing just this. It's sort of not straight, but sort of windy. That's what convoluted means. And so we call this area the proximal convoluted tubule. Then the tubular structure sort of dips down into the medulla, right? Dips down into the medulla. And this region is called the loop of Henle. Henle after the anatomist or physiologist who described this, so the loop of Henle or the Nephron loop. Those are interchangeable. Now, so the loop has a descending limb and an ascending limb. So the other part of the loop actually curves back upward. And there we have the distal convoluted tubule. Right, so if you're studying the anatomy here, the names of these parts of the tubules are representative of where they're located and how they're shaped. The proximal convoluted tubule is going to be closer to the glomerulus, and it's going to be convoluted. The loop of Henle dips down into the medulla, right? It has a descending limb and an ascending limb. And then the distal convoluted tubule is going to be further away from the glomerulus and also convoluted. Okay. Then we get to the remaining tubular structures, which lead us to the collecting duct. So the collecting duct, again, goes back down into the medulla, and then it eventually leads to the calyces, to the renal pelvis. So I'll put here calyces. To the renal pelvis, right? So this one was the collecting duct. Alrighty, so I want you to be able to recreate this image, understand this image in terms of the physiology that we're going to be speaking about. So how does the kidneys take this blood, filter it through this membrane, create a filtrate in this space, and then eventually fine-tune that filtrate all the way through to make urine? All right, that's the process we're interested in today.
Is that the drawing in the book is set up differently? Is that like how it should be set up, or?
So this is sort of
like the anatomy of it set up different.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that in a minute.
Okay.
So as Ryan is pointing out, it doesn't look like that in the kidney. So if you took a kidney, there's nowhere where you would see very clearly the proximal convoluted tubule, very clearly the loop of Henle. It's sort of very jumbled. And this is really a schematic representation showing the continuum of that tube. But we're going to look at it in terms of how it looks in the body. All right. So in terms of understanding where these structures fit, let's look at the renal pyramids. So you can see these rays in the renal pyramids. These are called the medullary rays. And these rays are actually formed from the loops of Henle of each of the nephrons that we just talked about. So picture the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule being up here in the cortex, those loops of Henle's and those collecting ducts dipping down into the medulla, right? And then coming right back up. And so what we have is a schematic representation of the tubular structures, right? But they're really within the renal pyramids here, right? On this slide, we're going to talk about some of the blood supply, right? Blood vessels that feed blood to the kidneys. We'll start off with the renal artery. That then divides into the segmental arteries. Then we have the interlobar arteries going to several lobes of the kidney. Then we got to the arcuate arteries, the cortical radiate arteries, the afferent arterioles. This is sort of where we are really interested. This gets down to the functional level of the structure that's bringing blood to the glomerulus, and that's the afferent arterioles. So blood is going to leave the afferent arterioles, filtered across the glomerular capillaries, and then leaves to the efferent arterioles. From the efferent arterioles, we go back to the peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta. Two very important structures, right? I want you to highlight those two vessels. Those are probably the most important vessels that we're going to come upon. The peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta. These are part of the veins that are draining blood from the glomerulus, and these are responsible for reabsorption. We'll talk more about reabsorption, but basically in the process of fine-tuning that filtrate, the body's going to pull certain substances from the filtrate back into the blood, and it's going to do so at the peritubular capillaries and at the vasa recta. Okay. The remaining veins are going to be the interlobular veins, which sort of trip students up, so there's no interlobular artery. There's the arcuate veins, the interlobar veins, the renal vein, then to the inferior ventricle. But again, the most important vessels here will be the peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta. All right. Now, so this image is sort of more closely showing those structures we just drew out. We have the glomerulus. So the glomerulus together with the Bowman's capsule, those two structures form what's called the renal corpuscle. So the renal corpuscle sitting in the cortex, the proximal convoluted tubule can be seen here, the loop of Henle, the descending limb versus the ascending limb. Then we have the distal convoluted tubule, again in the cortex, and then we get to the collecting duct. So once again, the collecting duct dips down into the medulla, and that becomes continuous with the calyces and then the renal pelvis. So this is where urine, after it's fine-tuned, can be expelled into the tract to head to the bladder. Right? This image is really nice after you've studied all of the physiology to come back and to relate it to the anatomy. Where exactly along the tubular structures is this taking place? Where's glucose being reabsorbed? Where's most of the water being reabsorbed? Where's the sodium being reabsorbed? So use this as sort of a land, like a layout for you to better understand the physiology, where each process takes place.